I've interviewed, I don't know how many economists about carbon taxes, and one angle that we've never discussed is can carbon taxes be used to improve the tax system? Well, Ken Boessenkool, who's a longtime conservative strategist and a professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy with McGill University, has written a paper about that. So we're going to talk to him. And welcome to the interview, Ken.
Good to be here.
Look, let's start with an overview of your argument, please.
A few years ago, I was at this Canadian taxpayer event with a bunch of kids who were anti-tax kids. And I walked into the room and I said, okay, kids, close your eyes. Imagine a world where we could have a flat tax rather than a progressive tax. Imagine a world where we could tax consumption instead of income. Imagine a world where we could tax something that is declining rather than something that is growing. And imagine that in that world, the left side of the political spectrum was making the argument for the tax that would do all of these things. And conservatives were opposed to all of this. What would you say? And they opened their eyes and said, that sounds crazy. And I said, that's exactly what's happening. And so that was a number of years ago. Since then, I've wanted to write a longer piece on this. And my piece, I don't know whether it starts this way or ends this way, but it basically says, even if you think climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, and that's not what I think, but even if you think that, I can make a complete argument for carbon taxes that's based on the tax system. Just to go through the argument, a carbon tax is a $30, $50, $70, a flat tax, right? We can replace an income tax with just progressive. A carbon tax is being taxed on things that shrink. What our goal in having a carbon tax is to have fewer emissions. So over time, government gets smaller. Every other thing that we tax, total consumption in the GST, personal income and corporate income, over time grow over time. So government gets automatically bigger over time. So if you're a conservative, you want a smaller government, why don't we tax things that are shrinking rather than things that are growing? And so when you put those arguments together, you can have a pure tax policy argument for taxing carbon consumption as opposed to income, which are all the other things we tax. And so that's basically the core of the piece.
Ken, what you have in mind here is it revenue neutral, where you increase, say, the carbon tax and then you reduce other taxes?
Absolutely, that would be the most important criteria. I was chief of staff to the Premier of British Columbia. We had a tax like that. It slipped away from revenue neutrality for a couple of years, but we made sure we got back to it. And I think a conservative carbon tax is revenue neutral. Absolutely.
I've thought for a long time that revenue neutrality is the way that carbon taxes can be sold. I live in British Columbia and nobody talks about it, and hasn't talked about it for the 11 years that I've been here. And it seems to me that is the major. So what would you argue that the Conservative Party, and I can't remember the CPC position on this, maybe it is that it should be revenue neutral, but a conservative carbon tax would be revenue neutral?
Look, the Conservatives have finally adopted carbon pricing, and I'm very happy about that. So I'll just say that and leave it there. They do not have revenue neutrality. They still want to spend a bunch of money on other things. And every plan in Canada except British Columbia takes some of the money and spends it on green initiatives. And my argument for that, and I wrote a piece in the Globe on this with Chris Reagan, who was the head of the Eco-Fiscal Commission, is if you're using the revenue from a carbon tax to do other things, it shows a lack of confidence in the ability of market mechanisms in the carbon tax to do its job. So I just think if you have a carbon tax, it should do its job. You should have confidence in it, and you don't need all this other stuff. And then you can use the revenue to cut other taxes to promote economic growth.
So I haven't seen a carbon tax argued from this point of view before. You reference in your piece, you reference economists like Jack Mintz at the University of Calgary. Is this a common for conservative economists? Is this a growing or a way to a more popular way to look at it from an economist's point of view?
Two quick things. In the US, there's a group of former Republican economist advisors that have written something similar to this. The argument I haven't seen is the taxing something that's declining as opposed to taxing something that's rising. Look, I left active partisan politics 2 years ago because I looked at my party across Canada and said, we are advocating a bigger government, higher regulatory approach to climate change. And if you start with the preposition, or if you start with the idea that we need to do something about climate change, the idea that we'd use bigger government, more spending, more regulation as the conservative solution to this, when our opponents were advocating for market-based solutions and a carbon tax, I just thought it was crazy. And I didn't see anyone out there who was defending this. And so I just I said, I'm going to take a couple of year hiatus. Chris Reagan was good enough to call me a professor. And put me on Max Bell, and I've been writing about it now for a year and a half, and I feel like I'm making some progress. So I'm pretty happy with it. All the ideas in there aren't that new. That, like I said, there's American economists, other people have written this around, but I sort of pulled it all into one place.
So Ken, if carbon taxes at some point, if carbon emissions fall, presumably, and then the government's revenue falls, do you have to then increase those other taxes again to make up for it, or do you simply let it fall and government makes do with less revenue?
Well, I mean, one of the things conservatives have been bemoaning for a long time is that when you tax personal income, which rises faster than GDP and faster than the economy, and when you tax it at progressive rates, revenue to government automatically goes up as a proportion of GDP. And so your government automatically gets bigger. And a conservative would say, I don't want government to automatically get bigger. I want government to say, we need more revenue. We're going to raise this tax to do so. And I think if that's the difference, it's not that I want necessarily, well, I kind of would like government to go shrink, but more importantly, I want to have a debate about it. Why do we have taxes in Canada that automatically make our government bigger? The government doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to make the case for bigger government. It just gets bigger government. And so I just think taxing something, I mean, this is why conservatives have always said tax consumption as opposed to income, because consumption tends to be much more stable over time than income, and tracks your GDP better than income, because again, we tax income on a progressive basis. So I just think it would be better, and conservatives would be happier if we could have the debate instead of just automatically getting bigger government.
A couple of months ago, I interviewed Professor Danny Cullen from Stanford about his new book about climate policy, in which he argued carbon pricing is one of three types of a government approach to reducing carbon emissions. The other is industrial policy and regulation. And he said a mix of those is the best way to go, not carbon pricing all by itself. Where do you fall down in that argument?
We could have a very technical discussion. There are a few things like methane emissions that are not covered by a carbon price. So you need to deal with some of those. The government itself needs to have policy to have more green vehicles and do all the other stuff because of the incentives that are there. But I would say that carbon pricing should do 90 to 95% of the work. And we should rely on the market, not government. We should rely on the market, not government spending. We should rely on the market, not government regulation, to get emissions down. And we either believe in the market or we don't believe in the market. And the tragedy in Canada is that over the last 7, 8, 10 years, conservatives have said they're not going to rely on the market to get emissions down. They're going to rely on the power of government. And I just find that to be the right word, I think, for me is I've found it to be embarrassing as a conservative to see conservatives argue for bigger government as a way to get emissions down. And so I just thought I'd take a break from partisan politics, make the argument, and see if I was a pariah at the end of it. And we're still not at the end, so we'll see. We'll see if I ever get back into partisan politics again. I suspect I will.
Well, how has this paper been received within Canadian conservative circles?
Look, Jason Kenney has a carbon price on industrial emissions. Doug Ford is getting in a carbon price on industrial emissions. Aaron O'Toole put out a package that we could quibble about some of the details, but the reality is he has carbon pricing on industrial and retail emissions. And so since in the last 2 years, we by conservatives have made a tremendous strides in the direction of using market mechanisms like carbon pricing and carbon taxes to get emissions down. So I'm enormously happy about that. I'm glad that we're not bringing in bigger government. and that Kenney and Ford are both doing it. O'Toole signals he wants to do it, and I think that's great.
Well, what's your take then on the output-based allocation system, where basically, like in Alberta, the oil sands producers get an 80 to 90% break on the carbon price in an effort to make them, to prevent carbon leakage and not penalize them for being an energy-intensive, trade-exposed industry. Would you, from your point of view, would you end those discounts?
No. That's an absolutely essential part of the carbon pricing system in Canada. BC doesn't have it, and it's caused some problems. When I was there as chief of staff, we tried to fix some of those problems. But as long as or until other countries have a carbon price, we're going to need to have output-based allocations. As the US moves more to price their carbon in whatever way they decide to do that, that'll bring the need to have our output-based allocations down. But especially in Alberta, you could not have a carbon pricing system without the output-based allocation. And Andrew Leach did the country an enormous favor by writing that report and making that case. And the federal carbon price under Trudeau was modeled after what Alberta did following Andrew Leach's recommendation. And I know some conservatives don't like Andrew Leach, but I think he's done the country an enormous service for identifying many things, but this in particular, the output-based allocations, was a very, very important thing for the Alberta carbon tax to move forward.
What's your take then on border carbon tax adjustments? There's some talk between Canada and the US about bringing those in. I can imagine oil sands, bitumen would be affected. What's your take?
This is probably the biggest challenge to carbon pricing and emissions reductions in Canada that we're not talking about. And I just hope that if and when we do something like this, that it becomes a North American border adjustment and not a Canadian-US border adjustment. That would be very bad for us. I would love to see more people talking about this. I'd love for people like Andrew, all of the economists that are working on carbon pricing should do a lot more work, in my view, on this. It's a big risk to Canada, and if Biden does this and puts it in place at the border, it'll be very bad for Canada. He hasn't shown many proclivities to be friendly to Canada on other files, and I'm very anxious about this. And we've got to get our stuff together and get this right.
Well, Ken, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights into carbon tax.
It's been enjoyable. Thank you.